There is a moment in every father's life when he stops being a teacher and becomes a witness. Mine came on a Saturday in October, in a small room behind a chapel, while a borrowed sports car gleamed in the parking lot outside, and a string quartet tuned their instruments somewhere down the hall. I was 67 years old. My only son was about to be married, and I was holding a gold pocket watch that had told the truth for 84 years, wondering if I had the right to give it to a man who was ashamed of me. When your son values a luxury car, he rented for 3 days more than the keepsake of the man who built this family line. That is the moment you know you have to teach him one last lesson. I did not know yet, standing in that small room, whether the lesson would land. I only knew I had to try, and I knew, the way old men know things, that whatever happened in the next hour would mark the rest of our lives together. But let me take you back a week, back to a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, when the maples along Beaver Creek were burning red and gold, and I still believed my son and I had time. My name is Robert Whitfield. I live in a cedar log house at the edge of the Hoosier National Forest, about 8 miles south of a town called Millbrook, Indiana. My father and I built that house in the summer of 1978, the year I turned 20. Every board, every joist, every nail, the two of us. My wife Eleanor and I raised our son in it. Eleanor passed 3 years ago. The house has felt very quiet since. I was a forest ranger for 39 years with the U.S. Forest Service, retired 5 years back as a district ranger. Most days I still wake at 5:30 out of habit, though the radio on my hip is long gone. I make coffee black in a percolator my mother gave us as a wedding gift. I sit on the front porch with one of Eleanor's old quilts across my knees, and I watch the light come up over the creek. The chickadees and the wood thrushes know my schedule better than I do. That particular Tuesday morning, the sky over the ridge was the color of pewter. There was frost on the wooden railing of the porch, and the cedar smell that always rises with the first cold mornings of fall was thick in the air. I drank my coffee slow. I listened to the creek running over the stones. I tried not to think about what was coming on Saturday. When I came back inside, I went to the little oak desk in the corner of the living room where I keep the things that matter. There is a cedar box on that desk. My father made it for me when I came home from the service in 1970. Inside the box is a folded American flag from his coffin, a photograph of my mother on her wedding day, the small silver crucifix Eleanor wore every day of her life, and a gold pocket watch made by the Hamilton Watch Company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the year 1942. I opened the box. I lifted out the watch. It is a Hamilton Railway Special, Model 992B, 14-karat gold case. The corners are worn smooth from 84 years of pockets and palms. There is a small scratch on the crystal that has been there since 1961, when my father dropped it on the platform at the Cincinnati rail yard, and a porter handed it back to him with a smile. The brass chain has darkened to the color of old honey. The face is white enamel with black Roman numerals and a small subsidiary seconds dial at the bottom. I wound the crown. 6 o'clock sharp. That was my father's rule, and he taught it to me when I was 9 years old. You wind a Hamilton at the same time every day, and it will not lie to you. Skip a day, and it begins to drift. Skip a week, and it forgets you. A man's word, my father used to say, is the same kind of machine. I held the watch in my palm for a long minute. I thought about my son. Mark was 32 years old, living in Chicago, working in what they call wealth management, which as far as I can tell means moving other people's money around in ways that make some of it stick to your fingers. He had a corner office on the 34th floor and a fiancée named Caroline Bellinger, whose family had 200 acres on the other side of Millbrook and a name that meant something in 3 counties. The wedding was Saturday. Mark had called me the night before. The call had lasted 4 minutes. He had told me what to wear, where to park, and that I would be sitting in the back row. He had told me in a voice that tried to sound kind, but came out tired, that there was no need for me to give a speech. The master of ceremonies had everything covered. I had said, "All right, son." I had said I would be there. I had not said anything about the watch. I set it back in its cedar box. I closed the lid. The kitchen was still warm from the coffee, and outside the wood thrushes were calling to each other across the ridge. And I stood there for a while just listening, the way I had listened in the forest for 39 years, waiting for the small sounds that tell you what is really going on. After breakfast that Tuesday morning, I walked out into the forest behind the house. There is a trail there I have walked maybe 10,000 times in my life. It runs along the north side of Beaver Creek for about a mile, then climbs up through a stand of white oaks and bur oaks that were old when my grandfather was a boy. I know every tree on that trail by name and by age. I know which ones lean which way when the wind comes hard out of the west in November. I know where the wild turkeys roost and where the red foxes den. A forest, if you give it long enough, will tell you everything. I was walking that morning to check on a particular tree. A white oak about 3/4 of the way up the ridge had taken a lightning strike the week before. I had heard the thunder come down on it from my porch, sharp as a rifle shot. I wanted to see what kind of wound the old tree was carrying. The leaves underfoot were crisp and dry. The light came through the maples in long red beams. As I walked, I let my mind go back to a morning 30 years ago, on this same trail, with the same kind of October light. Mark was 6 years old. He was sitting on my shoulders, his small hands fisted in my hair, his rubber boots bumping against my chest. I was teaching him the difference between a red oak and a white oak. The red oak leaf has points like little daggers. I told him. The white oak leaf has soft, rounded fingers. You can tell which is which from across the meadow if you know how to look. He had repeated it back to me in that serious little voice children use when they are trying to remember something important. Points like daggers, fingers like fingers. I had laughed, and he had laughed, and the sound had gone up through the trees and scattered the chickadees. That same boy, somewhere along the way, had become a man who wore suits that cost more than my first truck and rented Aston Martins by the day. I did not know exactly when it had happened. There is no single moment when a child turns from one thing into another. It happens the way oaks grow, slow, out of sight. And one morning you look up and the boy on your shoulders is a man who is embarrassed by the smell of cedar on your jacket. I reached the lightning-struck oak around mid-morning. The trunk was split down one side, a black scar running from the upper crown all the way to about 10 feet above the ground. The wood inside the wound was pale and raw. I laid my hand on the bark. It was cool. The tree was still alive. White oaks are stubborn. This one might live another 50 years with that scar. And the scar would close up slow, season by season. And one day it would be just a dark seam under the gray bark, almost invisible, but always there. I thought, that is what a wound does. If the tree is strong, it learns to live around it. I sat down on a fallen log nearby and pulled the Hamilton out of my coat pocket. I had taken to carrying it again the past few weeks, the way you carry something you are not sure what to do with. I opened the cover. The second hand swept steady around the small dial at the bottom of the face. Tick, tick, tick. Same as it was when my father carried it down the line from Cincinnati to Pittsburgh, checking the schedule against his own pulse. He had been a machinist for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 46 years on the line. He started in 1940 as a wiper boy, cleaning grease off the great black locomotives, and he retired in 1986 as a senior machinist with a small pension and a watch he never traded in for a newer model. The B&O gave him the Hamilton in 1942 for hitting 10 years of perfect attendance. Perfect attendance. 10 years. Through the war. Through 2 of his own children being born. Through his mother's funeral. He never missed a shift. He never was late. He gave me the watch on my wedding day, June 6th of 1981. Eleanor and I were married in the same Methodist chapel down on Center Street in Millbrook, where she had been baptized. Before the ceremony, my father came into the little room behind the chapel where I was sitting with my collar undone and my hands shaking. He sat down across from me. He did not say much. He laid the cedar box on the table between us. He opened it. He took out the watch and put it in my hand. And he said, "Son, this watch has not been wrong about anything for 39 years. Do not be the one who teaches it how to lie." That was the whole speech. I had carried the watch every day from that morning until Eleanor got sick. The last few years before she died. I had stopped wearing it. I do not know why. Maybe it felt cruel to carry something that kept perfect time when she had so little of it left. After she passed, I kept it in the cedar box. I had thought, when Mark and Caroline got engaged in the spring, that this would be the time. I would give it to him on his wedding day. The chain would unbroken. 3 generations of Whitfield men. 3 sets of hands winding the same crown at 6 o'clock in the morning. I closed the cover. I put the watch back in my pocket. I started down the trail toward home. The chickadees had gone quiet. The forest had that mid-morning stillness that always feels to me like the world is thinking something over. That afternoon I drove into Millbrook to buy a tie. I have an old gray suit I bought in 1994 for a friend's daughter's wedding. It still fits because I am the same weight I was at 40, give or take 5 pounds. But the tie I had worn with it for 30 years had finally given up. The lining had come loose, and Eleanor would have noticed in 2 seconds and made me throw it out. So I drove into town in the Ford F-15. I have been driving since 1998. And I parked on Main Street in front of Dot's Diner. Millbrook is not the kind of place most Americans think about when they think about America. We have about 4,000 people, 1 Methodist church, white clapboard, with a wooden steeple my grandfather helped repair after the tornado of '53, an Ace Hardware, a volunteer fire department, a grain elevator on the north side of town that has been painted the same shade of red for 60 years. The Baltimore and Ohio rail line still runs through the South End, although they call it CSX now, and the trains go through without stopping. The diner sits at the corner of Main and 2nd. Dot's Diner opened in 1961. Dot herself is 78 now, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with a laugh that can carry across the room. She has known me since I was 12 years old. She was a young woman when my father used to bring me in here on Saturday mornings after he came off the night shift. We would sit at the counter, and he would order black coffee and a stack of pancakes for me. And Dot would call me sweetheart and slide an extra pat of butter onto the plate. I went in that Tuesday afternoon out of habit as much as anything. The bell over the door rang. The place smelled the way it always smells, like bacon grease and burnt coffee and old vinyl booths. There were 3 farmers at the counter and 1 young woman in scrubs at a booth by the window. Dot was wiping down the counter when she saw me. Her face changed in a way I had seen 100 times. Pleased, but careful. She said my name and told me to sit myself down. I sat at the counter. She poured me coffee without asking. She set the mug down hard enough that a little of it spilled onto the saucer, the way she had been doing for 50 years. She asked if Saturday was the big day. I said it was. She asked if I was ready. I shrugged and told her I had bought a tie. She looked at me a long minute. Then she leaned on the counter with both hands and asked me, plain as day, whether Mark knew how lucky he was. She said she wanted a real answer. I held the coffee mug in both hands. I looked at the cream-colored formica of the counter. I thought about the call the night before. I thought about Mark's voice, tired and faintly embarrassed, telling me to sit in the back row. I told her I did not know. I told her I did not think he did. Not right now. She nodded slow. She did not say anything else for a while. Then she reached across the counter and put her hand on top of mine. Her hand was warm and dry and had the strength of a woman who had carried plates for 50 years. She told me boys forget for a while. They remember later. Usually too late, but they remember. I left a $5 bill on the counter, although the coffee was $1.50, and Dot did not give me the change. She never does. She squeezed my shoulder when I walked out. I bought the tie at the men's shop 2 doors down. Dark gray, plain, the kind of tie a forest ranger would buy. Walking back to the truck, I passed the small jewelry store on the corner. There was a young couple inside, leaning over the counter, looking at engagement rings. The boy had his hand on the small of the girl's back. The way he stood reminded me of Mark when he was 17, standing next to Eleanor at his grandfather's funeral. He had stood the same way, quiet, leaning in, listening with his whole body. I drove home the long way, past the cemetery on the hill outside town. Mount Olive Cemetery. My parents are buried there. Eleanor is buried there. There is a maple tree at the corner of the family plot that her cousin planted the year after she died. It is about 12 feet tall now. In another 20 years, if anyone is around to see it, it will be tall enough to shade the headstones. I did not stop that afternoon. I just slowed down and tipped my hat through the open window. Eleanor used to say I tipped my hat to the dead more than I tipped it to the living. She was not entirely wrong about that. When I got home, the sun was starting to drop behind the ridge. The light on the cedar siding of the house was the color of honey. I sat on the porch with the new tie still in its paper bag on my knee, and I watched a single doe step out of the tree line on the far side of the creek, drink for a long moment, and slip back into the shadows. I cooked a simple supper that evening: 2 eggs, a piece of country ham, a slice of toast with apple butter Eleanor's sister had sent up from Tennessee. I ate at the kitchen table by myself, the way I have eaten almost every meal for 3 years. The chair across from me was empty, the chair next to it the one Mark used to sit in when he came home from college on weekends, was empty too. After supper, I washed the one plate and the one fork and the one mug. I dried them and put them away. I went into the living room and I started a small fire in the wood stove. The cedar logs caught quick, and the smell of them filled the room, sweet and old. I sat in the wing chair Eleanor and I had bought at an estate sale in 1985 for $40. I opened the cedar box again. I took out the Hamilton. I sat there for a long time. I thought about my father, sitting in this same room, in the chair where I was sitting, the year before he died. He was 82. His hands were shaking from the Parkinson's. He could not wind the watch anymore. He had handed it to me one evening and told me to keep it. He said Mark was too young. He said when he was a man, I should give it to him. I had said yes, Dad. I had not told him that Mark was already 17 and pulling away from us in ways I could see and could not stop. I had not wanted to worry him. My father had died in 1996. The funeral was on a Wednesday in March. There was wet snow on the ground at the cemetery, and the grave diggers had laid pine boughs around the edge of the open grave so the mud would not show. Mark had stood next to me at the service. He was 18. He had cried at the casket, which I had not expected. He had loved his grandfather. The two of them used to sit together on the porch when Mark was small, and my father would tell him stories about the rail yards and the boys he worked with, and the long night runs from Cincinnati to Wheeling when the steam engines were still running. Mark had loved those stories. I was sure of it. I had heard him repeat them to his school friends. I had heard him tell one of them, summer before his senior year, to a girl he was trying to impress, in the kitchen, not knowing I could hear from the porch. He had told it well. He had told it the way my father told it, with the right pauses. Where had that boy gone? I turned the Hamilton over in my hand. I pressed the small catch on the side. The cover sprung open. I looked at the face. I looked at the small inscription engraved on the inside of the cover, in my father's hand, scratched there with an awl one quiet evening in 1981. I had read it 1,000 times. I had not shown it to anyone, not even Eleanor. It was the kind of thing a man keeps between himself and the man who gave it to him. I closed the cover. I held the watch flat against my chest for a moment. Then I made my decision. I would take it to the wedding on Saturday. I would go into whatever little room Mark was getting ready in, before the ceremony, and I would set the cedar box on the table, and I would give him the watch. I would tell him what my father told me. I would tell him about the 10 years of perfect attendance. I would tell him about the morning my father pressed it into my hand and told me not to be the one who taught it how to lie. I would tell him that I believed in him, because I did. I still did. Even with the rented Aston Martin and the corner office and the 4-minute phone call, I believed there was a boy underneath who knew the difference between a red oak and a white oak. There had to be. You do not lose that boy entirely. You cannot. I would give him the watch, and if he wanted to put it in his pocket and wear it down the aisle, that would be the answer. And if he did not, well, I would deal with that when I got to it. I put the watch back in the cedar box. I closed the lid. I sat by the fire until the logs burned down to coals and the room got cold around me. Outside, an owl called from the high pines across the creek. Once, twice, then silence, the forest settling in for the night. I thought, 4 more days, 4 more days, and we will see. I did not yet know what I was about to walk into. I did not know that the small room behind the chapel would be the place where the last thread between my son and me would be tested. I did not know that what I had decided that evening, sitting by the fire with the Hamilton in my hand, would have to be undecided before I could leave that room. But I did know one thing. I knew it the way an old ranger knows weather coming over a ridge. Whatever happened on Saturday, the watch would not lie about it. The watch never had. The watch never would. I banked the fire. I walked to the back of the house. I went to bed. Saturday came the way Saturdays come when you have not slept well. The light was already up when I opened my eyes, and the room was cold because I had let the fire die in the wood stove the night before. I lay there for a minute, listening. There was a hard frost outside. I could tell by the silence. The chickadees were quiet. The creek sounded sharper than usual, the way water does when the air has dropped below freezing. I sat up slow. My knees told me, the way they always do now, that I was 67 years old and not 47. I put my feet on the cold floor and I said a short prayer the way Eleanor had taught me. Just a few words. Lord, help me carry this day with grace. Help me keep my temper if it is tested. Help me see my son the way you see him. Amen. I shaved with care. I had nicked myself the last 2 times I shaved in a hurry, and I did not want to walk into that wedding with a piece of tissue paper stuck to my jaw. I combed my hair, what was left of it. I looked in the mirror, and I saw my father looking back at me, the same gray eyes, the same lines around the mouth, the same stubborn set to the chin. He had been about my age when he gave me the watch. I had not noticed at the time how he had aged. You never do, when it is your own father. I dressed slow, the gray suit, a clean white shirt Eleanor had ironed for me 3 years ago, and I had kept folded in the closet ever since, never wearing it, because she had been the last person to touch it. I put it on now, the new dark gray tie, my good leather shoes. I had shined them the night before, sitting on the porch with the box of polish and a cotton rag, the way my father had taught me when I was 12. The Hamilton went into the inside pocket of my suit coat, the one over my heart. The brass chain looped through the second buttonhole of the vest. I checked the time against the kitchen clock. Both said 9:45. The watch had not drifted by 1 second since I had wound it that morning at 6. I stood in the kitchen for a while with my coffee. I looked out the window at the line of bare maples along the creek. The wedding was at 2 o'clock. The drive to the Bellinger estate was about half an hour. I had told myself I would leave at 12:30, which would put me there at 1, an hour early, the way my father would have done it. I checked the cedar box once more before I went out the door. The watch was where it should be, against my chest. The box was empty now, sitting on the desk. I closed the lid. I touched the top of it once, lightly, the way you touch something that has held a piece of your life. Then I went out to the truck. The Ford started on the first turn. It always does. I had changed the oil 3 weeks before. I had checked the tires. I had filled the tank that morning. A man does not go to his son's wedding in a truck that might let him down on the highway. I drove the back roads, past the Henderson farm, past the empty silo at the old Moeller place, past the little white country church on Route 8, where Eleanor and I had been members for 41 years before we moved our membership to the Methodist church in town, because the country church had finally closed in 2014 for lack of a preacher. The building still stood. The windows were boarded up now. The bell was gone. I thought about how many weddings I had been to in my life. My own. My sister's. The year before she moved to Phoenix. Eleanor's brother's, in 1976. Maybe 20 more. Funerals I had been to more, of course. That is how it goes once you pass 60. The wedding list shortens. The funeral list lengthens. You learn to take your dark suit out of the closet without thinking about which one you are going to. The Bellinger estate sat about 3 miles outside Millbrook on the east side. The driveway was lined with oak trees that had been planted in the 1890s by old Mr. Bellinger's grandfather, when the family first bought the land. I turned off the county road onto the gravel drive at 1:01. The oaks closed in over me. The light came through their bare branches in dappled patterns on the hood of my truck. I drove slow. When I came out of the trees, the estate house rose up in front of me. A Georgian, painted white. 2 stories with green shutters. 6 bedrooms. I had heard. A barn that had been converted into a reception hall, which was where the wedding and the dinner were both going to happen. The lawn had been cut. The rose garden, even with the roses cut back for winter, had been raked and mulched. Every detail spoke of money that had been here a long time and was never going anywhere. I parked in the lot beside the barn, between a black BMW and a silver Lexus. The Ford looked exactly like what it was. A working man's truck, 28 years old, with a faint dent in the tailgate from the time I had backed into a stump in 1999. I did not move it. I did not park it around the corner where it would not be seen. I parked it where the attendant pointed. And there, near the front of the lot, parked under a string of white lights that someone had hung from the eaves of the barn, was the Aston Martin DB11, silver, long, low, polished to a mirror finish. There was a chauffeur in a dark suit standing beside it, smoking a cigarette and checking his phone. I got out of my truck. I straightened my jacket. I put my hand for a moment on my chest, just to feel the small weight of the Hamilton through the fabric. Then I walked toward the barn, where the wedding music was already starting to drift out across the lawn. The barn had been transformed. Whoever the Bellingers had hired had known what they were doing. White linen draped from the rafters. Candles in tall hurricane lanterns lined the aisle. 200 white chairs had been arranged in even rows. At the front, where the ceremony would happen, there was an arch built of white birch branches and trailing greens. It looked, I had to admit, beautiful. Eleanor would have liked it. I stood for a moment just inside the door, getting my bearings. A young woman in a black dress, holding a clipboard, walked up to me and asked if I was a guest of the bride or the groom. I told her I was the father of the groom. She blinked. She looked at her clipboard. She looked at me again. She said, "Oh, Mr. Whitfield. Of course. Please come this way." She walked me down the side of the room, past the chairs, toward a small hallway that had been built into one end of the barn for the wedding party. There were 2 doors, one marked with a small white card that said bride, the other marked groom. She pointed to the second door and told me Mark was inside. She said she would let him know I had come early. I told her I would let myself in. She hesitated, then nodded, and walked away. I stood in the hallway for a minute. The string quartet was playing something soft. Pachelbel, I think. Maybe Bach. I could hear voices on the other side of the bride's door. Women's voices, laughing softly. Someone was getting their hair pinned. The door to the bride's room opened. Caroline came out. She was already in her wedding dress. A long, simple, ivory dress with a high collar and lace sleeves. Her hair was pulled back. She was carrying a pair of white satin shoes in her hand. She had not yet put them on. When she saw me, she stopped. Her face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, then something like relief, then something quieter that I could not name. She set the shoes down on a small table in the hallway. She came over to me with her hands held out. She took both of mine and both of hers. She said, "Mr. Whitfield." She said it with a kind of weight on the name. Then she said, "I am so glad you are here." I told her she looked beautiful. I told her she looked like a bride. Her eyes filled, just a little, and she laughed at herself and waved her hand at her face the way women do when they do not want to ruin their makeup. She said her mother had been crying off and on all morning, and she had promised herself she was not going to, not until the vows, not until then, not. I asked her if she was nervous. She thought about it for a second. She said she was not. She said she was something else, but she did not know what to call it. I told her that was usually a good sign. I told her my Eleanor had said the same thing on our wedding day. Not nervous, just something else. Caroline smiled. Then she looked down at our hands, hers still holding mine, and her face changed again. She lowered her voice. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, I want you to know something." She said, "I do not care about the cars. I do not care about the chairs. I do not care about any of this. I care about your son, and I care about you. I want you to know that." I did not know what to say to that. I had been ready for a polite young woman who would shake my hand and call me sir and forget my name by the end of the night. I had not been ready for this. I felt something move in my chest, the way the wind moves through pines before a storm. A small tightening, a small loosening. I told her thank you. I told her her parents had raised a fine young woman. She squeezed my hands. She said, "My father is in the front row already. He has been asking when you would get here." I told her I would say hello to him before the ceremony. She nodded. She picked up her shoes. She started back toward the bride's room. Then she stopped at the door, turned, and looked at me one more time. She said, "Mark is very lucky. I think sometimes he forgets that. But he will remember." She went inside and closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long minute. I thought about what Dot had told me 3 days before. Boys forget for a while. They remember later. And here was this young woman, 29 years old, telling me almost the same thing in almost the same words. I did not know what to do with that, except to file it away somewhere. Then I turned toward the door that said groom. I lifted my hand. I knocked once. I did not wait for an answer. I went in. Mark was standing in front of a tall mirror on the far side of the room. He was already in his tuxedo, black, slim cut, a satin lapel that caught the light. The bow tie was around his neck but not yet tied. He was working at it with both hands, his head bent forward, his shoulders tense. There was a glass of bourbon on the side table, untouched. The label said Pappy Van Winkle. I knew the price of that bourbon. I had seen it in a magazine once. A bottle of it cost more than I used to make in a week, back when I was a young ranger. He looked up when I came in. He saw me in the mirror first. Then he turned. He said, "Dad." I closed the door behind me. The room was small, a dressing table, the tall mirror, 2 upholstered chairs, a side table, a window with the late October light coming through it. There was a vase of white roses on the dressing table. There was a card next to the vase. I did not look at the card. I set the cedar box on the dressing table. I did not say anything yet. Mark looked at me. He looked at the box. He looked at me again. He said I was early. He said the ceremony did not start for almost an hour. I told him I knew that. I told him I wanted a minute with him before things got busy. He let out a small breath, not quite a sigh. He turned back to the mirror and went back to working at his bow tie. His fingers were stiff. He had been to enough weddings to know how to tie one, but his hands were not cooperating today. I watched him for a few seconds. Then I stepped up behind him, met his eyes in the mirror, and asked if he wanted help. He looked at me. Something old and small passed through his face. Then he nodded. I turned him around. He was about my height. We had been the same height since he was 16. I lifted the 2 ends of the bow tie. My hands knew what to do. My father had taught me when I was 18, the summer before I left for the service. You loop the long end over the short. You take the bottom of the loop and pull it through. You shape the wings flat. You tighten until it sits even against the collar. It took me about 20 seconds. I straightened his collar. I stepped back. He looked at himself in the mirror. He said thank you, in a quiet voice. There was a moment then, a small open space in the room. He could have said anything in that moment. So could I. He was looking at me in the mirror, and I was looking at him. And we were both waiting for the other man to step into that space first. I stepped in. I told him I had brought something. I told him I had been thinking about it for a long time. I told him I had wanted to bring it to him on his wedding day, the way my father had brought it to me on mine. I opened the cedar box. The Hamilton lay there on the small piece of red velvet I had cut to fit the bottom of the box 30 years ago. The brass chain coiled beside it. The gold case caught the lamplight. It looked, in that small room, exactly like what it was. A working man's watch. A railroad watch. 84 years old. Still keeping perfect time. Mark looked at it. I watched his face. I have spent a lifetime watching faces in the woods. The faces of deer at the edge of a meadow. The faces of hikers who have gotten themselves lost and do not yet want to admit it. The faces of fellow rangers when the call comes through about a fire on the South Ridge. I know how to read a face. I read my son's face, and I saw, in the half-second before he covered it, exactly what I had been afraid of seeing. Disappointment. He did not want it. He pulled himself together fast. He smiled. the kind of smile a man uses in a business meeting when he is trying to get out of something gracefully. He stepped over to the table. He picked up the watch. He turned it in his hand. The gold caught the light. He said, "Dad, wow, this is really something." I did not say anything. I waited. He said, "I mean, this is incredible. Granddad's old watch. I remember this." I waited. He set it back in the box. He looked at his own wrist for a second. He was wearing a watch already. Stainless steel. Black face. A watch I did not recognize. But the brand was visible enough that I caught it. It was not a Rolex. It was something more expensive than a Rolex. He had bought it. Or maybe Caroline's father had given it to him. I did not know. He said, "Dad, the thing is, the suit is kind of slim cut. A pocket watch is going to bulge in the vest, you know. And honestly, Caroline's friends are all they all know about watches. They all wear, current things. I do not want to look like I am wearing my grandfather's stuff at my own wedding. You understand?" He said it kind. He said it the way you say a hard thing to a man you do not want to hurt, but you also do not want to be slowed down by. He said, "Maybe later. Maybe you hang on to it for now. Maybe when we have kids, our son could have it someday. That would be nice." He looked at me. He was waiting for me to agree, to say, "Of course. Son, I understand. No problem." I did not say that. I stood there for a long moment. The string quartet had moved on to a different piece. I could hear it faint through the wall. The light through the window was making a long rectangle on the wooden floor between us. I was not angry. I want you to understand that. I had thought, all week, that if this moment came, I would be angry. I had thought I would feel the kind of cold fury that a man feels when he is dismissed by his own blood. But that was not what came. What came instead was a great quiet sadness. The kind of sadness you feel when you watch a thing happening that you cannot stop, and that you maybe should not stop, because the thing has to happen for some other thing to happen later. I looked at my son. I looked at the watch in the cedar box on the table between us. I told him to sit down for a minute. He looked at the door. He looked at me. He sat down in one of the upholstered chairs. I sat down in the other. The cedar box was on the table between us. I told him about his grandfather. I did not tell him things he had not heard before. I had told him most of it when he was a boy, about the rail yards, about the night runs, about the 10 years of perfect attendance, about the morning his grandfather had been given this very watch by a foreman named Mr. Halloran, who had not handed out a gold watch for perfect attendance in 15 years before that day, and who had said, when he handed it to my father, that he was glad he had lived long enough to do it once more. I told Mark what my father had said to me on my wedding day, about the gold not being worth as much as the fact that the watch had never been wrong about anything in 39 years, about how a man and his word are the same kind of machine. Wind it at the same time every day, and it will not lie to you. Skip a day, and it begins to drift. Skip a week, and it forgets you. I told him my father had handed this watch to me and said, "Do not be the one who teaches it how to lie." Then I stopped. I let the silence sit in the room. I asked Mark a question. I asked him whether he thought Caroline's friends were going to remember him in 20 years because of the watch he wore on his wedding day, or whether they were going to remember him because of the man he turned out to be. He did not answer. I asked him whether he thought they would respect him more for a car he rented for 3 days, or for a family that had kept its word for 100 years. He did not answer. He was looking at the floor. His hands were on his knees, and his knuckles were white. I closed the cedar box. I did not raise my voice. I have never raised my voice at my son in my life, and I was not about to start on his wedding day. I picked up the box. I held it for a moment. Then I took the Hamilton out. I unhooked the brass chain. I threaded it through the second buttonhole of my own vest, where it had been all morning. I dropped the watch into the inside pocket of my suit coat, the one over my heart. I stood up. I told him this watch was going to stay with me. It would stay with me until he understood what it meant. I told him I was not punishing him. I was not angry. I loved him very much. But this watch was not a thing you wear because it looks right. It was a thing you wear because you have earned the right to carry it. Today was not that day. Maybe another day would be. I hoped it would be. But not today. He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. He did not say anything. I told him I would be in the back row, the way he had asked. I told him I would not give a speech. I told him I was proud of him for what he was about to do, marrying a young woman like Caroline, and I told him I would be there for him today and every day after, whether he understood me or not. Then I walked out of the room. I closed the door behind me. In the hallway, I stopped for a second. I put my hand against the wall. I was breathing harder than I had thought. The string quartet had moved on to something slower, a piece I did not know. I waited until my chest evened out. Then I walked back into the barn, down the side aisle, all the way to the back row of those 200 white chairs. I sat down on the end seat closest to the aisle. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the birch arch at the front of the room. I looked at the candles burning in the hurricane lanterns. I tried not to think about anything in particular. A few minutes later, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit came down the aisle toward me. Tall, white-haired, with the kind of steady walk that men of his generation never lose. Mr. Bellinger, Caroline's father. We had met twice before, at the engagement dinner in May and at a Sunday lunch in August. Both times had been polite and short. He stopped at my row. He held out his hand. I stood up and shook it. He had a strong grip, the way men of our age do when they have something to say but cannot say it directly. He told me he was glad I had come. He said it the way you say it to a man you respect, but do not know well. He said Caroline had been talking about me all week. I told him she was a fine young woman. I told him he and his wife had done well. He looked at me for a moment. He looked like he was about to say something else. Then he glanced toward the front of the barn, where the minister was now taking his place under the birch arch. He pressed my shoulder once, lightly, the way one old man can speak to another without using words. Then he walked back to the front row. I sat down again. I did not understand what had just passed between us. I would not understand it for almost 3 more months. But I felt it, the way you feel weather changing in your knee before you can see the clouds. The music shifted. The wedding march began. Everyone stood. Mark walked out from a side door at the front of the barn, with the minister beside him. He was pale. He kept his eyes on the back of the room. He was looking for me. I saw the moment he found me. His shoulders dropped a half-inch. He nodded, almost too small to see. I nodded back. Then Carolyn came down the aisle on her father's arm, and every face in the barn turned toward her. She was beautiful in the way brides are beautiful, which has nothing to do with the dress or the hair, and everything to do with the look in her eyes when she sees the man she is walking toward. When she passed my row, she did something I will remember as long as I live. She turned her head, just slightly, and looked at me, not at the front of the barn, at me. And she smiled. The ceremony was beautiful. It really was. The minister said the words. Mark said his vows. Caroline said hers. Her voice broke a little when she said for better, for worse. Mark's hand was trembling when he slid the ring on. From the back row, I could see all of it. Mark looked at me. Not once. Many times. Through the whole ceremony, his eyes kept finding mine across that long room. He was not looking at the Rolexes around him. He was not looking at the chauffeur with the Aston Martin parked outside. He was looking at his father, at the back row, in a 30-year-old gray suit, with a brass chain across the vest pocket, and a gold watch ticking quietly over his heart. When they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Caroline reached out without looking and squeezed my hand as she passed. The reception followed. I went into the dining barn next door with the rest of the guests. White tablecloths, tall centerpieces, a 4-piece jazz band on a small stage. I found my place card at a table near the back, with 3 older couples I did not know. They were polite. We talked about the weather. We talked about the corn harvest. None of them asked who I was, and I did not volunteer it. I lifted 1 glass of champagne when the toast was called for the bride. I did not lift one for my son. I told myself that would come another day. I drank a single sip and set the glass down. I watched Mark across the room. He was working the crowd the way young men in his line of work learn to do. Handshakes, quick laughs, a hand on every back. But every 2 or 3 minutes, his eyes came back to me. I did not look away. I did not signal anything. I just sat there with my hands in my lap, and I let him find me each time he needed to. Around 8 in the evening, before they cut the cake, I stood up from my table. I made my way to the edge of the dance floor, where Caroline was standing with her mother. I told them I needed to head home. The drive back was long, and I did not see as well in the dark as I used to. Caroline's mother said all the right things. Caroline hugged me. She held on a second longer than she needed to. She whispered in my ear, "Drive safe, Mr. Whitfield. I will see you soon." I did not say goodbye to Mark. He was across the room, laughing with a group of men in expensive suits, his back to me. I let him be. I walked out of the barn into the cold October night. The chauffeur was still there with the Aston Martin. He was leaning against the door, finishing another cigarette. He nodded at me as I passed. I nodded back. The gravel crunched under my feet. The stars were out, sharp as nails over the bare oak branches. I drove home in the dark. The heater in the Ford took its time. I went the long way, past Mount Olive Cemetery. I almost drove on past, but I did not. I turned in at the gate. I parked along the gravel path. I walked across the frosted grass to Eleanor's stone. The maple tree at the corner of the plot stood quiet over me. Its last leaves had fallen the week before. The wind moved through its bare branches, and somewhere up on the ridge a screech owl called, twice, then went silent. I sat down on the cold stone bench her cousin had put there the year after she died. I took the Hamilton out of my pocket. I held it in my palm. I told her what I had done. I told her about the room behind the chapel. I told her about Mark's face when he saw the watch. I told her about Carolyn at the hallway door. I told her about Mr. Bellinger pressing my shoulder in the back row. I told her I did not know if I had done right. I told her I was tired in a way I had not been tired in a long time. The kind of tired that does not come from work. The kind that comes from carrying something a long way and not knowing where to set it down. The wind moved. The maple branches creaked. I sat there for almost half an hour. I did not cry. I do not cry easy. But there was a long moment when I bent forward over my own knees and held the watch against my forehead. And I felt something pass through me that I had no name for. When I stood up, my legs were stiff with cold. I walked back to the truck. I tipped my hat to the row of stones as I went. When I got home, the cedar logs were still warm in the wood stove. I built the fire back up. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, plain bourbon out of the bottle Eleanor's brother had brought up from Kentucky 2 Christmases ago. I sat in the wing chair with the Hamilton in my hand. I listened to it tick, 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 steady as a heart. I thought about my father. I thought about what he would say if he were sitting across from me in the other chair. I thought he would not say much. He would nod. He would maybe sip his own bourbon. He would maybe say, "The boy will come around." Robert. They always do. The ones with anything in them. He would say that. And then he would let me sit with it. I did not know yet how long it would take. I did not know that 4 months would pass before I heard my son's voice again. I did not know that the next time I saw him, he would be standing on my front porch in the middle of winter, with snow on his shoulders, and a different kind of look in his eyes. I only knew, that night, that I had carried the watch home over my heart, the way it was meant to be carried, and that whatever came next, it would not be me who taught it how to lie. I sat by the fire until the logs burned down to coals. The owl called one more time, far off. The Hamilton kept its time. I did not sleep for a long time. The first snow came on the 3rd of November. I remember because I had marked the date in the small calendar I keep in the kitchen, next to the wood stove. I have kept that calendar for 40 years. I write down the first frost, the first snow, the last hard freeze in spring. I write down when the wood thrushes come back in April. I write down when the bucks start rubbing the saplings in October. It is a habit from my Forest Service days. The woods do not change all at once. They change by inches. You only see the changes if you write them down. The wedding had been on a Saturday. By the following Wednesday, I had not heard from Mark. By the next Wednesday, I had not heard from him either. By the 3rd Wednesday, I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. By the 4th Wednesday, I had settled into a kind of quiet I had not known since the first months after Eleanor died. It was not that I expected him to call right away. I did not. I had told him, in that small room behind the chapel, that I would be there for him whether he understood me or not. I had meant it. But there is a difference between meaning a thing and living with it. Meaning a thing takes about a minute. Living with it takes the rest of your days. I kept my schedule. That was the most important part. A man who lives alone has to keep a schedule, or the days will start to blur together and pull him under. Coffee at 6. Win the Hamilton at 6:01. Eggs and toast at 6:15. The morning paper at 7. The small county paper that still gets delivered to my mailbox on the road. Out to the woodshed by 8. Wood split, stacked, covered. Lunch at noon. The afternoon, depending on the weather. I would either work on the house or walk in the forest. The forest had taken on its November look. The maples were bare. The oaks were holding their leaves the way oaks do, dry and brown, rattling in the wind like old paper. The light came down through the canopy in long, flat angles. The deer were moving. I saw a 6-point buck one afternoon on the trail by Beaver Creek, his neck swollen with the rut, his eyes black. He stood and looked at me for a full minute before he turned and walked off through the brush. I went to the Methodist church on Sundays, the way Eleanor and I had gone for the last 10 years of her life. Pastor Coleman had been there for 20 years. He was about my age. He knew me well enough to know what to say and what not to say. The first Sunday after the wedding, he shook my hand at the door and said, "Robert, good to see you." He did not ask about Mark. He did not ask how the wedding had gone. He just held my hand a half-second longer than usual. That was his way of telling me he knew. In a town the size of Millbrook, news travels in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. I sat in the same pew Eleanor and I had sat in for 41 years. Third row on the left. I sat alone. I had been sitting alone for 3 years now. The hymn book felt heavier in my hands than it used to. The voices around me sounded fainter, but I went. Every Sunday. Because that was what we had agreed to do when we joined that church in 1984. Eleanor was gone, but the agreement was not gone. A man keeps his word. After service, I would shake hands with the people I had known for decades. The Petersons, the Vogels, old Mrs. Calloway, who had taught Mark in 3rd grade and still asked about him every Sunday. The first Sunday after the wedding, she asked, "How is that boy of yours, Robert?" I told her he was good. I told her he had gotten married last weekend. Her face lit up. She said, "Oh, Robert, how wonderful." She said she wished she had known. She would have sent a card. I told her not to worry about it. She squeezed my arm. She moved on to talk to someone else. I stood there for a moment in the church hall, holding a paper cup of weak coffee, and I thought about how a man can be hollowed out by what he cannot tell other people. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper. I tried to write Mark a letter. I tried 3 different times. The first one started, "Dear son." The second one started, "Mark." The third one started, "I have been thinking about that day." None of them got past the first paragraph. I crumpled all 3. I burned them in the wood stove. The paper curled and blackened. And then it was gone. I did not try again. Some things you cannot write. Some things have to come around in their own time. The way the wood thrushes come back in April. You do not call them. you wait. The Hamilton stayed in my pocket every day. I wound it at 6 every morning. It did not drift 1 second through all of November. December came hard. The first week brought an ice storm that took down power lines all over the county. I lost electricity for 2.5 days. It did not bother me much. The wood stove kept the front of the house warm. I have an old hand pump on the well behind the kitchen that still works. I cooked on the stove top. I read by the light of 2 kerosene lamps Eleanor had bought at an antique store in Bloomington in 1991 because she liked the way they looked. They turned out to be more useful than decorative. The county sent crews out. The lights came back on Thursday afternoon. Life went on. I drove into Millbrook on the Saturday before Christmas to do my small shopping. I do not put up a tree anymore. I have not put one up since Eleanor passed. But I do keep a small wreath on the front door, the way she liked. I bought one at the hardware store. I bought a few cans of soup and some flour. I bought a pound of coffee. I stopped at Dot's for a bowl of chili. Dot was behind the counter. The lunch crowd had thinned out. She brought the chili over herself and slid into the booth across from me. She had not done that in a long time. Dot is the kind of woman who runs her diner from her feet, not from a chair. She did not ask me about Mark right away. She asked about my woodpile. She asked about the truck. She asked if my sister was coming up from Phoenix for Christmas. I told her no. She was too old to travel now. We would talk on the phone Christmas morning, the way we did every year. Then Dot told me something I had not known. She told me her son Daniel had not spoken to her for 2 years and 3 months after his father died. He blamed her. He thought she had not done enough at the end. He just stopped calling. He just stopped coming around. And then one Tuesday in March, he just walked in, sat down at this very booth, ordered the meatloaf special, ate every bite, reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "Mama, I am sorry." That was the whole apology. But it was enough. Dot said. It was enough because in 2 years, he had become the kind of man who could say it. She patted my arm. She got up. She went back behind the counter. She did not look at me again until I paid the bill. I drove home in the late afternoon light. The fields between Millbrook and my place were full of brown corn stubble and patches of crusted snow. The sky was that pale gray blue you get in the Midwest in December, when the sun goes down at 4:30 and the cold rolls in over the land. When I pulled up to the mailbox at the end of my drive, I saw a thick stack of mail inside. I had not checked it in 3 days. I gathered it up. I drove the 1/4 mile to the house and parked. I went inside. I built up the fire. I sorted the mail on the kitchen table. Bills, junk, a Christmas card from my sister in Phoenix, a card from the Forest Service Retirees Association, a card from the church, and then a card I did not recognize, a heavy cream-colored envelope, my name written across the front in a careful hand I did not know. I sat down. I opened it. It was a Christmas card with a simple drawing of a pine wreath on the front. Inside, in the same careful hand, were 5 words. I think about you, Caroline. That was all. No mention of Mark. No return address on the envelope, although it had been mailed from Chicago. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding the card. The wood stove ticked as it warmed up. The light outside the window faded. I thought about Caroline in the hallway of that barn. holding my hands in both of hers, telling me she did not care about the cars. I thought about her in her wedding dress, turning her head to look at me as she walked down the aisle. She had thought about me. 12 weeks after the wedding, she had thought enough about me to find my address, buy a card, and write it out by hand. But she had written it alone. Mark had not signed it. Mark. I understood at that moment. Did not know she had sent it. I got up. I went to my desk. I put the card in the cedar box, next to the Hamilton. I closed the lid. That night I dreamed about my father for the first time in maybe a year. He was at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in, on Oak Street in Millbrook. He was wearing his B&O coveralls. The Hamilton was on his vest. He looked up at me and he said, "You keep doing right by him. Robert, he will find his way." I woke up at 4 in the morning, sat up in bed, and listened to the silence of the house for a long time. I made coffee. I wound the watch at 6. I went on. I am going to tell you something now that I did not learn until later. I did not learn it for almost 3 months after the wedding. I learned it in pieces, the way a man learns most important things. A word from Caroline, a look from her father, a canceled check that was never cashed. The full story came together slowly, the way a beaver dam comes together stick by stick. But I am going to tell it to you now in one piece, the way I think about it now, because that is the only way it makes sense. While I was sitting in my cedar log house at the edge of the Hoosier National Forest, keeping my schedule and not hearing from my son, Mark was in trouble in Chicago. Real trouble. The kind he could not tell anyone about. The first piece of it was the credit cards. Mark had been carrying balances since his late 20s. It had started small. A weekend in Aspen with 3 buddies from work. A new suit for a promotion that had not quite come through yet. A first-class flight to a wedding in California. He had told himself, every time, that this would be the last one, that he would catch up next month, that the next bonus would clear it. The bonuses had not cleared it. By the time he met Caroline, 2 years before the wedding, he was carrying about $28,000 across 4 cards. By the time he proposed, he was carrying about $40,000. By the morning of the wedding, in that small room behind the chapel where I had sat across from him with the cedar box on the table, he was carrying just over $53,000. The Aston Martin had been $3,000 for the day. The Pappy Van Winkle had been a gift from his boss. The watch on his wrist had been a gift from Mr. Bellinger, given to him in private at the engagement dinner. Caroline did not know any of this. Mark had been very careful. He paid the minimums on time. He had a separate email address for the credit card statements. He had told her he was saving for a house. He had even shown her a fake spreadsheet once. A man can carry that kind of thing for a long time, if he is careful. But carrying it costs something. It costs you the parts of yourself that are honest. It costs you the parts of yourself that look your father in the eye. By the time Mark stood in front of that mirror tying his bow tie on his wedding day, he had been hollowing himself out for almost 5 years, one credit card statement at a time. When I walked into that room with the Hamilton in a cedar box, he was not in any condition to take it. He could not have taken it without breaking. The watch would have broken him. The way an honest thing breaks a dishonest man who looks at it too long. I did not know that at the time. I read his face in that mirror, and I saw disappointment, and I thought he was rejecting me. He was not. He was protecting himself from a mirror he could not afford to look into. The second piece of it came in November, 3 weeks after the wedding. Mark made a decision he would spend the rest of his life trying to live down. He was at the office on a Friday evening. A client of his, a man in his 70s whose account Mark had managed for 2 years, had an annual advisory fee charged to his investment account. The fee was almost $12,000. Mark, who had access to the client's account in the routine course of his work, made an adjustment in the system. He moved the fee into a holding account he controlled. He told himself it was a loan. He told himself he would put it back within 90 days, when his year-end bonus came in. He told himself the client would never know. The client never looked at his statements anyway. The client had a daughter in California who handled most of his affairs. It took Mark about 20 minutes to do. He sat in his corner office on the 34th floor while he did it. The lights of Chicago were coming on outside his window. He told me later that he watched his own hands on the keyboard like they belonged to someone else. He went home that night to the apartment he and Caroline were renting on the Gold Coast. Caroline had made dinner. They had eaten by candlelight. He had laughed at her jokes. He had kissed her in the kitchen. He had felt, he told me later, like a man wearing another man's clothes. He paid down 2 credit cards over the weekend. The balance dropped from $53,000 to $41,000. He told himself he could breathe again. He told himself it was a loan. It did not last. 2 weeks later, the holding account showed up on an internal audit. Mark's name was attached to the entry. His supervisor called him into a conference room on the 42nd floor on a Thursday afternoon, with 2 compliance officers and a lawyer from the firm. They asked him to explain. He did not lie. To his credit, he did not lie. He told them everything. He told them how long he had been struggling. He told them about the credit cards. He told them about his father. Although he did not say my name, he told them what he had done was wrong. He asked, in that meeting, what he needed to do to make it right. What he had to do was this. He had to pay back the $12,000, plus interest, plus a penalty. He had to do it within 30 days. He was demoted from his role as a senior advisor. He was banned from managing client accounts directly for 2 years. He kept his job, which surprised him. The compliance officer told him later, over coffee, that the only reason he had kept his job was that he had told the truth in the meeting, and that he had told it before they asked the harder questions. That was the first time in his adult life Mark had done a hard thing because it was right, instead of because it was easy. He paid back the $12,000. To do it, he sold the watch Mr. Bellinger had given him at the engagement dinner. He sold a Patek Philippe wristwatch for $9,000 cash to a dealer in the Loop. He never told anyone about that sale except, eventually, me. He came home that Thursday night, and he told Caroline. All of it. The credit cards, the fee, the audit, the demotion, the watch. Caroline did not yell. She did not cry. She sat at their kitchen table for a long time, looking at her own hands. Then she got up, walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and stayed in there for 2 hours. When she came out, she had a small overnight bag. Mark thought she was leaving him. He told me later that he had not breathed for the entire 2 hours she had been in that bedroom. He said it was the worst silence of his life. But she was not leaving him. She came out, and she said she was going to her father's for a few days. She said she needed to think. She said when she came back, they were going to figure out how to fix this together. But she needed him to know one thing. He was not going to lie to her again. Not about money. Not about anything. If he lied to her again, they were done. She left. She drove down to Millbrook, to the Bellinger estate. That same night. She stayed for 5 days. On the 4th day, she found something in her father's study that changed how she looked at me. The 3rd Saturday in January was bright and cold. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees overnight, and by noon it had only come up to 22. The sun was out. The sky was the kind of hard blue you only get in the middle of an Indiana winter, with no clouds and no softness. I was out behind the house splitting wood. I had been working since after lunch. I had a load of seasoned oak that needed splitting before the next snow came in. My maul has a hickory handle Eleanor's brother turned for me in 1996. The head is sharp. I had built up a rhythm. Set the log on the chopping block. Settle the feet. Swing. Step back. Set the next log. I heard the tires on the gravel before I saw the car. I rested the maul on the block and turned around. A black SUV came up the drive. Slow. Careful. It was not a vehicle I knew. It pulled up next to my Ford. The driver's door opened. Caroline got out. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, dark brown, jeans, snow boots, a knit cap pulled down over her ears. No makeup. There were dark circles under her eyes that I could see from 20 feet away. She stood next to the SUV for a moment, looking at me across the yard. Then she lifted her gloved hand in a small wave. I lifted mine back. I set the maul against the chopping block. I walked over. I asked her if she was all right. She said she did not know yet. She asked if she could sit with me for a little while. I told her, of course. I told her to come up to the porch. I went inside and put the coffee on. I came back out with 2 heavy ceramic mugs. The cedar log walls behind us were warm from the day's sun. The porch faced east, away from the worst of the cold wind. We sat in the 2 old wooden chairs Eleanor and I had refinished one summer when Mark was 9. She held the coffee in both hands. Steam rose up into the cold air. She did not look at me for a long minute. Then she did. She told me everything. She started from the beginning. She told me about the credit cards. She told me about the fee Mark had moved. She told me about the audit. She told me about the night he came home and laid it all out at the kitchen table. She told me about driving down to her father's. She told me about the 5 days she had spent there, walking the back fields of the estate alone in the cold, trying to decide what kind of marriage she had agreed to. She did not cry while she told me. She told it the way Caroline tells things, which is straight on, without trying to soften it for the listener. I listened. I did not interrupt. The Hamilton was over my heart, ticking. I felt it more than I usually did that afternoon. When she finished, she was quiet for a while. The sun was starting to drop toward the trees. The shadows of the maples along the creek had grown long across the snow. She said there was something else. She said 4 days ago she had been in her father's study. He kept old letters in a drawer of his desk. He had done it since she was small. She had been looking for a photograph her mother had asked her to find. She had found something else. She reached into the inner pocket of her wool coat. She pulled out an envelope. She held it for a second. Then she handed it across to me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a check. It was made out to William Bellinger. It was dated October 15th of the year before, 1 week before the wedding. The amount was $42,000. The signature in the corner was mine. The check had never been cashed. There was a small word stamped across the front of it in red ink. Void. Behind the check was a folded letter. I knew the letter. I had written it. I had sat at my kitchen table on an October evening, with a pot of coffee going cold beside me, and I had written it in one draft because I had known exactly what I wanted to say. Caroline told me her father had shown her the letter. He had shown her the check. He had told her he had voided the check the day he received it. He had told her he had kept both of them in his desk for almost 5 months because he could not bring himself to throw them away. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, you gave my father $42,000 for our wedding. You sent him your retirement savings. You wrote him a letter saying it was a father's contribution to his son's wedding day. You asked him not to tell Mark. You said it was between 2 men and their consciences." She said her father did not cash the check because he respected me too much. She said she did not know any of this until 4 days ago. Mark did not know. He still did not know. She had not told him. I held the check in my hand. I looked at it for a long time. I had written it on a Tuesday evening in October. I had taken almost everything I had saved from the Forest Service pension, minus what I needed to live on for the next 2 years. I had not told Eleanor about it, because Eleanor was gone. I had not told Mark, because Mark would not have understood it then. I had not told anyone. I had driven the letter into Millbrook the next morning and put it in the mail myself. I had not done it because I wanted credit for it. I had done it because I had known, by the start of October, that Mark could not afford the wedding he was about to throw. I had seen the engagement ring on Carolyn's hand at the May dinner, and I had known what that ring had cost. I had seen the venue. I had heard the plans. I had done the math an old man does without trying, and I had known that the numbers did not add up. I had not wanted my son to start his marriage in debt to his father-in-law, so I had paid the difference, quietly, the way my own father would have done it. I had thought Mr. Bellinger would simply use the money. I had not expected him to keep the check in a drawer for 5 months. I did not know what to say. I sat there with the check in my hand and the letter folded under it. The sun had dropped below the trees. The porch was getting cold. Caroline put her hand on my knee, just lightly, the way Eleanor used to. She said I was the only man in her husband's life he was afraid of disappointing. She said she did not know what to do. He would not call me. He would not come down here. He thought I was done with him. He thought the watch in my pocket meant the door was closed. She said she was not asking me to do anything. She was not asking me to call him. She thought this had to come from him. She thought it had to come from him, or it did not count. But she had needed me to know. She had needed me to know what he was carrying, and she had needed me to know what her father had been carrying all this time on his desk in a drawer. I looked out at the creek. A pair of crows had landed on the ridge across the way. They were calling to each other in the cold air. The sound carried. I told her, "Thank you for coming, Caroline." I told her she had done the right thing. We sat there for a few more minutes without saying anything. Then she stood up. She buttoned her coat. She told me she was driving back to Chicago that night. She told me she was not going to tell Mark she had come here. She said when he was ready, he would come on his own. I walked her to the SUV. I opened the door for her. She turned and put her arms around me. She held on a long second. She got in. She drove away. I stood in the driveway until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Then I walked back to the chopping block. I picked up the maul. I split another 40 minutes of wood until the sun was completely down and my hands were too cold to grip the handle. I split the wood the way I had split wood for 40 years, with my whole body steady, one swing at a time. That night, after supper, I took the Hamilton out and opened the cover. I looked at the inscription my father had scratched there in 1981. I had not let anyone read it in 45 years. I did not know yet that in another 2 weeks, my son would be standing on my front porch in the snow, and that I would open the cover of that watch in front of him for the first time. I only knew, that night, that he was carrying more than I had thought, and that the silence of the last 4 months had not been what I had thought it was. It had not been distance. It had been a man trying to find his way back to a door he was not sure he had the right to open. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. 2 weeks went by after Caroline's visit. I did not do anything different. I did not call Mark. I did not write him another letter. I split the rest of the oak. I shoveled the walk twice. I went to church. I read in the evenings a book on the history of the Hoosier National Forest that the pastor had loaned me at Christmas. I waited. I have learned, over the course of a long life, that waiting is a kind of work. Most people do not understand that. They think waiting is what you do when you are not doing anything else. But real waiting is its own kind of labor. You hold a thing in your mind without forcing it. You let it ripen. You do not pick the fruit before its time. Because if you do, the fruit is bitter, and you have wasted the whole season. I waited for Mark the way I had waited, for 39 years, for forest fires to break and for storms to pass, and for lost hikers to come back down off the ridge. You do what you can, then you let the work of the world do the rest. It was a Tuesday morning in late January, bright and cold. I had been out at 6 to wind the watch and bring in firewood. The thermometer on the porch read 11 degrees. There was new snow on the ground, maybe 4 inches. The kind of dry, powdery snow that squeaks under your boots. The sky was pink behind the bare maples along the creek. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. I do not get many text messages. Most people who know me call. The phone is a small flip phone Mark bought for me 4 years ago because Eleanor had asked him to. I had not wanted it. I had not understood why I needed it. But I had kept it, because she had asked. And after she was gone, I had kept it for the same reason a man keeps an empty chair across from him at the kitchen table. I picked the phone up. I flipped it open. The little screen showed Mark's name. The message was 3 sentences. Dad, I need to talk to you. Can I come down this weekend? I sat there for a long minute. The kitchen was warm. The coffee in my mug was still hot. Outside, a downy woodpecker was working on a dead branch of the big silver maple by the porch. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. I read the message 3 times. Then I wrote back, I am slow on a phone keyboard. It took me maybe 5 minutes to type out the words and find the period at the end of each sentence. When I was done, the screen said this: Door is always open, son. Saturday morning is fine. I will have the coffee on. I read it back. I corrected one word. I sent it. The little envelope icon on the screen showed it had gone. I closed the phone. I set it on the table. I sat there for a few more minutes without moving. Then I got up. I washed my coffee mug. I went out to the porch and stood for a while looking at the woods. The woodpecker had moved on. A red cardinal was hopping along the snow at the base of the silver maple, his color sharp against the white. He flew off when he saw me. The maple branches creaked in the small, cold wind. I am not a man who prays out loud often, but I prayed standing there on the porch that morning. I prayed a short prayer for my son. I prayed for the right words when he came. I prayed I would have the wisdom to say them. I prayed I would have the wisdom to be quiet when quiet was the better thing. Amen. Then I went back inside. I cleaned the house. Not because the house was dirty. The house has not been dirty in 3 years. But there is a kind of cleaning a man does when he is preparing for something. Sweeping floors that do not need sweeping. Wiping down a counter that is already clean. Plumping the cushions on the couch where no one has sat. It is not cleaning so much as touching every part of the place where the thing is going to happen. So the place knows. I made a pot of beef stew on Friday evening. I cut the chuck roast in cubes. I browned them in lard, the way Eleanor had taught me. I added carrots and onions and potatoes from the root cellar. I added a bay leaf and salt and pepper and a pinch of caraway seed, the way my mother had made it. I let it simmer for 3 hours on the back of the wood stove. I baked a pan of cornbread to go with it. The recipe was Eleanor's mother's. I have made it 100 times since Eleanor passed, and it still does not taste exactly like hers did. But it is close enough. I set out 2 place settings at the kitchen table. The plates Eleanor had picked out at a yard sale in 1986. The cloth napkins her sister had embroidered for our 20th anniversary. The water glasses we had used every day of our marriage. When I was done, the house smelled like beef and onion and wood smoke. The kitchen looked the way it had looked when there were 3 of us at the table and Mark was 9 and Eleanor was alive, and the years ahead of us were long and full. I sat by the wood stove. I read for an hour. I went to bed at 9. I slept hard. I woke at 5:30 Saturday morning, the way I always do. I wound the Hamilton at 6:01. I made coffee. I waited. He came at 10:15. I heard the car coming up the drive a long time before I saw it. The driveway is gravel and snow, and a car coming slow makes a sound you can hear from the porch. I went to the front window. I watched my son pull up to the house. He was driving an old Toyota Camry. Gray. Maybe a 2014. Maybe a 2015. There was rust around the back wheel well. The license plate was Illinois. It was not the BMW he had been driving the last time I had seen him on the highway, almost a year ago. He sat in the car for a long minute with the engine off. He had his hands on the steering wheel. He was looking at the house. Then he got out. He was wearing jeans and an old canvas barn coat I recognized. It had been mine in the 1990s, and he had taken it to college as a freshman because he wanted something of his father's to wear in the cold. He had kept it. The shoulders had darkened with age. There was a small repair on the left elbow Eleanor had stitched 20 years ago. He walked toward the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at me through the window. I opened the door. He came up the steps. He stopped on the porch about 3 feet from me. He did not say anything for a few seconds. Neither did I. Then he reached out his hand, and I took it. And we shook the way 2 men shake hands when they have not seen each other in too long and do not know yet what kind of meeting this is going to be. His hand was cold. His palm was rougher than it had been the last time I shook it. I noticed that. I did not say anything about it. I told him to come on in. The kitchen is warm. He stepped inside. He stamped the snow off his boots on the rug Eleanor had made by hand in 1989. He took off the canvas coat and hung it on the peg by the door, where it had hung when he was a boy. He stood there for a second, looking around the kitchen. The same wood stove, the same round oak table, the same blue dish towel folded over the handle of the oven. Nothing had changed. He had grown. The kitchen had not. I poured him coffee. Black. He took the mug in both hands and held it for a long time before he drank. The steam rose up around his face. I asked him if he had eaten. He said no. He had driven straight through from Chicago. He had left at 4 in the morning. I told him to sit down. I cut him a slice of leftover cornbread. I warmed up a bowl of stew. I set it in front of him. He ate. He did not talk while he ate. I sat across from him with my own coffee. The Hamilton was over my heart. I felt it tick against my chest. When he was done, he pushed the bowl away. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at his hands. He was working up to something. I let him take his time. He said, "Dad." He said, "I have a lot to tell you. Some of it is bad." He said, "I need to tell you all of it." He said, "Before I tell you, I want you to know I did not come here to ask you for anything. I am not asking for money. I am not asking for help. I am asking you to listen." I told him to go ahead. He told me everything. He told me what Caroline had told me 2 weeks before, but he did not know that yet. He told it from his side, the credit cards, the slow climb of debt over 5 years, the lies he had told himself, the lies he had told Caroline by leaving things out, which he said now was the same as lying. The Friday night in November in his office on the 34th floor when he had moved the client's fee into the holding account. The 2 weeks of telling himself it was a loan. The audit. The Thursday in the conference room on the 42nd floor. He told me about telling the truth in that conference room. He said it was the first hard thing he had ever done in his adult life. He said his hands had been shaking the whole time. He said he had not slept for 2 days before the meeting because he had known what he was going to have to say. He told me about the demotion. He told me about being banned from managing accounts for 2 years. He told me his pay had been cut almost in half. He said he was making, now, what he had made coming out of business school 9 years ago. He told me about selling the Patek Philippe to a dealer in the Loop for $9,000 cash. He told me about paying back the $12,000. He told me they had sold the car, sold most of the furniture in their apartment, moved out of the Gold Coast, moved into a small 2-bedroom in a less expensive neighborhood near where Caroline had grown up visiting her grandmother. He told me he was paying down the credit card debt as fast as he could. He told me it was going to take 3 or 4 years. He told me Caroline had stayed with him. He said he still did not understand why. He said every day he expected to come home and find her gone, even though she had told him she was not going anywhere. He said the trust was going to take years to build back. He said he was prepared to spend those years. I listened. I did not interrupt. The wood stove popped once. Outside, the cardinal had come back to the silver maple. I could see him through the window over Mark's shoulder. When he finished, he sat for a minute looking at his hands again. Then he looked up. He said, "Dad." He said, "I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you because I owe you the truth. I have owed you the truth for a long time. I should have been telling you the truth for years. I should have called you. I should have come down here 100 times. I should have come down here 3 months ago, 2 weeks after the wedding, when I knew what I had become. I did not." He said, "The reason I did not is the worst part." He said, "I did not come because I could not face you." He said, "You are the only man in my life I am afraid of disappointing." And I knew. That day you came into the room with the watch. I knew the second I saw the box on the table that I could not take it, that I had not earned it, that if I put it in my pocket, I would be lying to it the way I had been lying to everything else. He said, "The watch knew." He said, "You knew." He said, "You were the only one in the room that day who saw straight through." He said, "I have spent 4 months becoming the kind of man who can sit at this table again." He said, "I have not become him yet." He said, "I am working at it." He said, "I came here to tell you I am working at it, and to tell you I am sorry. For the car, for the back row, for the words I said about the watch, for the 4 months of not calling, for all of it." I sat there for a long moment. The cardinal on the maple flew off. The light through the window shifted. I reached across the table. I put my hand on top of his. His knuckles were red and dry from the cold. I did not say anything for a few seconds. Then I said, "Son." I told him I had known he would come. I told him I had not known when, but I had known. I told him a man who can tell the truth in a room full of lawyers is a man worth waiting for. He bent his head forward. His shoulders moved. He cried at my kitchen table for the first time since he was a small boy. He did not make any noise. The tears just came down his face onto the back of my hand. I let him cry. I did not move my hand. We sat at the table for a long time without saying much. The stew bowl was empty. The coffee was gone. The wood stove had burned down a little, and I got up and added 2 more pieces of oak. The fire caught. The kitchen warmed back up. I asked Mark if he wanted to take a walk before lunch. He said yes. He went and put the canvas coat back on. I put on my Forest Service jacket, the green one with the patch I have not taken off in 5 years. I put on my wool cap. He put on a knit hat that had been his in high school, which he had found in the front closet on his way out. We walked out into the woods together. The snow was deep enough to come up over the tops of our boots in places. The trail along Beaver Creek was the trail I had walked 10,000 times. The trees stood quiet around us. The light came through their bare branches in long gray beams. Our breath made clouds in the cold air. We did not talk for the first half-mile. We just walked. He stayed a half-step behind me, the way he had stayed a half-step behind me on this trail when he was 6 years old, his small boots crunching in the leaves while I named the trees for him. When we got to the lightning-struck white oak about 3/4 of the way up the ridge, I stopped. I put my hand on the bark. The scar was still there, raw on one side, slowly closing on the other. I told Mark about the lightning strike in October. I told him I had come to check on the tree the day after. I told him a white oak can live another 50 years with a wound like that. The scar closes up slow, season by season, and one day it is just a dark seam under the gray bark. Always there, but the tree learns to live around it. He stood next to me with his hand on the bark. He did not say anything. I told him a wound is not the end. I told him a wound is what happens to a thing that is alive. I told him the trees that never get hit by lightning are the ones that grow up sheltered, and those are usually the ones that come down in the first hard wind. The trees that take the strike and survive, those are the strong ones. Those are the ones that stand for 100 years. He nodded. I could see him taking it in. We walked back down the trail. The sun was higher now. The snow was starting to soften on the south-facing slopes. By the time we got back to the house, the porch was in full sunlight, and the icicles along the eaves were dripping. We sat on the porch for a few minutes before going inside. I had brought the cedar box out with me when we came back. I had set it on the small table between the two chairs. Mark looked at it once, then looked away. I opened the cedar box. I took out the Hamilton. I told him I wanted to show him something I had never shown anyone. Not Eleanor, not Caroline, not him. In all the years he had asked about the watch. I pressed the small catch on the side of the watch. The cover sprang open. I held it out so he could see the inside. The inscription was scratched into the gold on the inside of the cover, in my father's hand, with an awl. One evening in 1981. It was small. The lines were uneven. My father had not been a writing man, but the words were there, and they had been there for 45 years. The inscription read, "To my son Robert. Time is the only thing a man cannot earn back. Spend it on people who keep their word." Mark read it. He read it twice. He sat very still. Then he put his hand over his mouth, and he closed his eyes, and his shoulders shook in a way I had not seen since the day Eleanor was buried. I waited. After a while, he took his hand down. He looked at me. He said, "Granddad wrote that." I said yes. He said, "That is what he wanted you to know." I said yes. He said, "That is what you wanted me to know on my wedding day." I said, "Yes, son. That is what I wanted you to know on your wedding day. That is what I wanted you to carry when you walked down the aisle. That is what I have been carrying in my pocket since I was 22 years old. That is what your grandfather carried before me, in a different pocket, on a different watch chain, when he was a young man checking the schedule against his own pulse on the night runs." I closed the cover. The face went quiet against my palm. The second hand kept moving inside. I held the watch out to him. I said, "It is yours now." He shook his head. He said, "Dad." He said, I cannot. He said, I have not earned it yet. He said, I came down here to tell you I am working at it. I did not come down here to take it. I said, Mark, I said, you have earned the right to start carrying it. You have not earned the right to stop carrying it. There is a difference. Your grandfather did not give it to me because I had finished anything. He gave it to me because I was starting something. He trusted me to keep starting it every morning for the rest of my life. That is what the watch is. It is not a reward. It is a job. I said, you wind it at 6. Same time every day. You skip a day. It drifts. You skip a week. It forgets you. I put the watch in his hand. I closed his fingers around it. He held it. He looked down at it. His hand was shaking a little. Then it steadied. He said, 6 o'clock, same time every day. I said, every day, son. We sat there on the porch for a while longer. The sun moved across the snow. A crow called from the ridge. Then I told him there was one more thing. I went inside. I came back out with a small cedar box I had built myself in the workshop behind the house. Over the past 4 months, it was about the size of a paperback book, plain, smooth, hinged in brass. I had used cedar from a tree that had come down on the property in a storm 3 years ago. I had milled the boards myself. I had put it together one piece at a time, in the quiet evenings of November and December and the first weeks of January, when I had not known whether Mark would ever come down the drive again. I set it on the table between us. I told him to open it. He lifted the lid. Inside, on a piece of soft cotton cloth, was a small leather-bound notebook. The leather was dark from age. The cover was scuffed at the corners. The binding was holding, but barely. I told him it was his grandfather's. I told him my father had kept a journal for the last 20 years of his life. I told him I had inherited it when my father died, and I had read it once, slowly, over the course of a winter. I had not shared it with anyone since. Not Eleanor. Not even when she had asked. I told Mark his grandfather had been a better man than I would ever be. I told him the journal would tell him things about the man on the night runs and the rail yards that he had never heard. I told him to read it slow, not all at once. A few pages at a time, over the years. I told him the journal would still be there waiting for him when he was 40, when he was 60, when he was my age. He closed the cedar box gently. He put his hand on top of it. He said, Dad. He said, thank you. That was all. He did not have any more words. Neither did I. We sat on the porch until the sun started to drop behind the trees, and then we went inside, and I made supper. And we ate together at the kitchen table for the first time in 3 years. Mark drove back to Chicago that night. He hugged me before he got in the old Toyota. He held on a long second longer than men usually do. He drove off down the gravel drive, the taillights small and red in the dark. And I stood on the porch in my Forest Service jacket and watched until I could not see him anymore. I went inside. I built up the fire. I sat in the wing chair with my hands empty for the first time in months. The Hamilton was not in my pocket. The Hamilton was in my son's pocket, somewhere on the highway between Millbrook and Chicago. He would wind it at 6 the next morning. That was the arrangement now. I want to tell you the rest quickly, because the rest is the part that takes time to live and almost no time to say. Mark and Caroline stayed in the small apartment for 2 more years. He paid down the credit cards one by one. He sent the last payment in the spring of his 2nd year after the demotion. He told me about it on the phone the same evening. I had been sitting on the porch, listening to the spring peepers in the wet place at the bottom of the property. I had picked up the phone, and he had said, "Dad, it is done." He went back to work as a senior advisor in the fall of that year. The firm had watched him through the 2 years he had been demoted. They had decided he was the kind of man they wanted handling other people's money, because of who he had become when he had been caught handling it wrong. He turned out, in the end, to be very good at his job. Not because he was clever with the numbers, although he was, because his clients trusted him in a way they did not trust many men. Caroline gave birth to their first child on a Tuesday in October, 2 years and 7 months after their wedding. A boy. They named him Henry James Whitfield. Henry, for my father. James, for Caroline's grandfather. They called me from the hospital. I drove up to Chicago the next day in the Ford, and I held that baby in my hands for the first time in a room with too much light and too many machines. And I knew, the moment I held him, that the chain was not broken. The chain had been bent. The chain had been tested. The chain had not broken. Mark and Caroline brought Henry James down to Millbrook for the first time when he was 3 months old. It was the 2nd week of January. Cold, clear. The light coming over the ridge the way it does in winter, low and gold. They stayed for the weekend. Caroline cooked supper on Friday night. Mark and I split wood Saturday morning. Henry James slept in a small wooden cradle I had built in the workshop over the previous summer, when I had known they were expecting. The cradle was cherry. The headboard had a small carving of an oak leaf on it, the white oak leaf, with the soft, rounded fingers I had taught Mark about 30 years before on the trail along Beaver Creek. Sunday morning, the 3 of us were in the kitchen. Caroline was at the stove making pancakes. Mark was at the table with Henry James on his lap. The baby was awake, blinking up at the ceiling, his small hands moving. I came in from the porch with an armload of firewood. I set it down by the stove. I looked over at my son and my grandson. Mark reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out the Hamilton. He wound the crown. 6:01. Same time. Every day. He had not missed a morning in 2 years and 7 months. The watch had not drifted. He looked at me. He nodded. Then he laid the Hamilton, very gently, on the small round chest of his sleeping son. The baby stirred. The watch rose and fell with his breathing. The brass chain caught the light from the kitchen window. 4 generations of Whitfield men were in that kitchen at that moment. My father, in the hand he had used to scratch words into the inside of the cover in 1981. Me, standing by the wood stove with my hands smelling of cedar. Mark, sitting at the table with his hand resting on his son. And Henry James, 3 months old, breathing under a gold pocket watch that had not been wrong about anything in 86 years. Caroline turned away from the stove. She saw what we were doing. She did not say anything. She put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled. The pancakes started to burn. None of us moved. Mark looked up at me. He said, "Dad." He said, "I think he is a Whitfield." I told him, "Son, he was a Whitfield from the day he drew breath. The watch only tells us what is already true." Mark picked up the Hamilton off his son's chest. He kissed the baby's forehead. He closed the cover. He put the watch back in his vest pocket. He wound the crown again, just one click, the way you do to make sure. Caroline saved the pancakes. We ate breakfast together at the round oak table where Eleanor and I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts. The sun came up higher over the trees. The Hamilton ticked over my son's heart. That was 4 years ago. Mark and Caroline have a second child now, a little girl named Eleanor, after my wife. They come down to the cedar log house once a month. The cradle has been used twice. The journal is on a shelf in their apartment, with a ribbon marker about a third of the way through. Mark told me last summer he is taking my father's advice, a few pages at a time. Some chapters he reads twice. He is in no hurry. I'm 71 now. My knees are worse. The walks in the woods are shorter than they used to be. I still wake at 5:30 out of habit. I still make coffee in the same percolator. I still write down the first frost on the calendar in the kitchen. The Hamilton is in my son's pocket every day. He winds it at 6. The watch does not drift. The chain holds. There are things I would have done differently in my life if I could go back. Things I would have said to Eleanor. Things I would have said to Mark when he was a boy. There are letters I should have written to my own father before he died, and did not. There are evenings I worked late when I should have come home. There are mistakes I will carry to my grave. But on the question of the watch, on the question of that Saturday in October when I walked into a small room behind a chapel with a cedar box in my hands, on the question of what I did and what I said and what I waited 4 months to receive back, I have no regret. I would do it the same way again. Because what I learned, sitting on my porch through that long winter, is that a father's job is not to give his son everything he asks for. A father's job is to give his son something to come back to. If you have a son or a daughter you have not heard from in a while, I want to tell you something. Keep the porch light on. Keep the door open. Do not chase them. Do not lecture them. Do not write the letter you want to write. Wait. Wind the watch at 6. Split the wood. Go to church. Tip your hat to the dead. Live your days the way you said you would live them. Whether anyone is watching or not. They will come back, or they will not. But you will be the kind of man they could come back to. That is the most a father gets to choose. And a quick word before I let you go. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. I know it was a long one. I know some of you are out there in kitchens like mine, in small towns like mine, with quilts on your knees and coffee going cold in your hands. I see you. This story was for you. If anything in this story spoke to you, if you thought of a son or a daughter or a father or a grandfather while you were listening, do me one small favor. Hit the thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this, share it with them. You never know which story might be the one that opens a door. The good Lord has given me more years than I ever expected to have. He gave me back my son. He let me hold my grandson. He let me carry a watch my father gave me, and pass it on to the next man in the chain, and stand in a kitchen full of light and watch 4 generations of my own blood breathing in the same room. That is more than any man should ask for. I am grateful for every day of it. Wind your watch. Keep your word. Stay close to the people who love you. God bless you.